Well, my name is Mark Fancher, and I am here on behalf of Side Effects and Already Been Chewed, the company that I work at, to give a presentation on organic destruction in Vellum. So we're going to be doing stuff like this, where we've got the lemon explosion. We're going to look at paper tearing and some ginger root tearing and other stuff like that. And it's going to go a little bit fast because I wanted to cram in as much knowledge as possible. So it's a good thing that you have a little bit of a background in Houdini, but I'll be around afterwards. We can kind of talk a little bit more in depth if there's anything you want to kind of explore. So let's do a little bit about me section here. I'm lead effects artist and also a senior motion designer at a company based out of Dallas called Already Been Chewed. And on the side, I like to make tutorials. I've got Stop Being Afraid of Houdini through mograph.com, as well as Houdini School tutorial on trees, and as well as a bunch of stuff on my YouTube channel, and more to come in the future. So, trees, yeah. I have a self-taught generalist background. Around probably 2009, I started with Maya, and then eventually made my way into Houdini, where I've found myself for the past 5 years working full-time, mostly in Houdini, but also generalist, hopping around the pipeline a little bit here and there, as you do in motion design. The place that I work at is a company called Already Been Chewed, like I said, based out of Dallas, and it's a really cool spot. It's a motion design studio. We specialize in product launches and promo graphics, stuff like boats and watches and shoes. And we're a team of generalist specialists. So while all of us are capable of wearing multiple hats in the pipeline, each one of us has a specialty, where my specialty would be like working in Houdini and coming up with procedural setups and stuff like that. Other people are like good at generalisting around in Cinema 4D, but maybe really talented at ZBrush and modeling as well. So it allows us to be nimble, and it creates a very fun and collaborative group to work with. We're all kind of self-directing, helping direct each other, and it sort of is it's just a very fun and collaborative group to work with. This is a look at our studio space, newly renovated in 2022. It's a very cool space for us on-site workers. There are a total of 18 employees. Most of them are on-site, but we also have several full-time remote employees across the globe, several in the US, 2 in Greece, 1 in Spain, and 1 in Ukraine. And it has been a journey having him work with us through the experience that he's been going through. He is a complete badass and an amazing designer. And there is, up in the corner there, in the upper right-hand corner, is the owner and founding artist, Barton Damer, doing some business in his office. And he's a great guy, excellent mentor, friend, and boss. And so he is great at collaborating, has great ideas and vision for these projects that we work on, and he also cut together a reel for us, and we'll take a look at that right now. So thank you. I don't know if you can tell, but we have a lot of fun. Lots of really creative projects and stuff like that. So the first actual Houdini stuff I want to get into right now is this paper tearing example that we did for Louis Vuitton. So let's take a look at some of the inspiration we got for that. When the client sent us this sort of piece of construction paper with a macro kind of tear going on, and they wanted to sort of just kind of animate this in a CG macro shot and just get in there a little bit closer than maybe with a camera or whatnot, and just kind of do a kind of stylized version of that. So this is our inspiration. And that led us to do some early R&D. This is some of the early R&D. Basically, it was two planes, or it was one plane that I kind of booleaned in half using just kind of sliced it with a very shallow plane, and added some constraints and kind of pulled it apart. And so this was kind of like, it was kind of getting there, but we added a little bit of, you can kind of see right here, we added a little bit of like these kind of fibers that were coming apart, but that didn't really feel right because it almost felt like sticky or slimy. So we kind of ditched that and went on to this next kind of version that you see here, which is a little bit more, we didn't focus so much on like actually animating, using Vellum to animate the fibers themselves, just kind of focused on the look there. And you can see in this earlier version, we have kind of a seam running up to the left that we had to eventually get rid of, but this was starting to feel more like a macro shot of construction paper to us. So let's get into a demo of how this was set up. And I'm going to be playing back a pre-recorded version of me running through Houdini, and that's more or less just to make sure that we can keep on track and get as much stuff covered as possible. So it's going to go a little bit fast, but hopefully you can all hang on and enjoy the ride. So this is the setup for that paper tearing that we just were looking at here, and it's not as bad as it looks. Most of it is just creating masks, and a lot of it is doubled up because there's two halves of the paper, and it was just easier to split the network in half and just kind of work on one side and the other independently in certain areas. So let's go over how this is built. At the top, we start with a grid, and we copy that grid 4 times, like so, to kind of create some very thinly packed layers of paper. Then over here, what we're going to do is create some cutting lines we're going to use to fracture apart our geometry. So we bring it into this for each loop, give it a little extrusion, and then we run it through a Boolean fracture, and we get this kind of layered paper kind of fracture that you see right here. Then in this section, we're just going to be creating groups and grouping the left side, the right side, also creating a group for the active points in the middle. This is the area that's going to be actually simmed. So we're going to be pinning everything except for these active points in the middle here. Then here I'm just creating a mask on one side and then attribute transferring it to the other side. So we can use this little mask to define these stitch points. These stitch points are going to be used to create some constraints to kind of give it a little stickiness when we're pulling the paper apart later. Here we're setting up our Vellum cloth constraints, and we're having this work on everything we're pinning down everything except for the active points here, and that will allow us to animate our paper and kind of have that tear going along. Here what we're doing is we are gluing, and we're using the class attribute that we created for the left and right hand sides as a cluster attribute. That's going to exclusively glue only pieces of a like class together. So you can see we've got all these layers of paper on one side. They're all going to be stuck to one another. We don't want those coming apart. We only want the two halves coming apart. So that's what that cluster class attribute does to help with. And then here what we're doing is we're taking that stitch points group that we created, and we are using a stitch constraint to stick it onto the right-hand side. So we've got these constraints just running along the seam to add a little bit of resistance. There's a breaking threshold. So when enough stretch stress occurs, it'll overcome that stitch constraint and break it. Here we just add a couple bend nodes, and we're using those bend nodes to do a very rough animation. But then when you feed it into Vellum, you start to get this kind of much more organic feeling paper tear. So it's really nice to add like secondary motion, this feeling of it building up some resistance and then eventually pulling apart. So that's sort of a look at that. Let's look at a kind of a closer play blast of the camera angle we've got here. You can see this is just the base Vellum sim, and it's just adding a little bit to it, just a little bit of character to the movement of the paper to give it a little bit of resistance, but not too much. So it's kind of a subtle effect, but I think that it helps. In this next section over here, it's basically about creating every possible mask you could ever imagine. One of the most important ones, though, is this debris source mask. So we're using the debris source node, which detects when the primitives separate from one another, and it's a little solver that just spawns points in the areas where the pieces separate from one another. And what we can do is we can actually take these points and generate a mask out of it that we can use to track which parts of our paper have been torn and which parts of our paper are still intact. So you can kind of see that right there. The red has been torn, blue is still intact. Then over here, it's just every other normalized fall off you can imagine from every edge of the fracture, just keeping track of all that so we can use it later on. And then in this little section here, it's just a bunch of post-processing. We're adding a little noise to it, ruffling up the edges, extruding. And then down here, we're scattering little fibers. So we scatter a bunch of points, add a bunch of little tiny lines to it, use some vex to kind of shape it, give it a direction, add some noise. And then we also copy a bunch of these little fibers to the edges of the paper layers to give it that kind of a fray look. We do this to both sides, and then we need to attach it back to our animation. So this is a prim UV lookup with a spatial offset. It's a little bit faster, I think, than doing a full-on point deform, but you can kind of see that here in the vex code on the right-hand side. Then what we do is we actually transfer the mask attribute back onto these fibers. And so that will allow us to get rid of fibers that shouldn't exist yet because we haven't really done the tear yet. So we're using that mask attribute to spawn these particles, or these fibers, I should say. So here's kind of a close-up view of those fibers kind of spawning, a little flipbook of them spawning as this tear is happening, as our camera is kind of tracking along with it. And you can see they're kind of color-coded for the different layers they belong to as well. Then down here, we're just scattering more fibers on the top of the paper. So these are fibers that are just going to be there the whole time. We're just creating this density fall off, similar to what we did before, adding lines, adding noise, and then doing this same kind of prim UV lookup to attach these to their respective pieces of paper. So those will animate along with our paper. To optimize, we bring in the camera frustum, and we do some camera culling right here on both the spawn fibers and the fibers that are kind of already there. And so you can kind of see that here in kind of a bird's eye view. This is the render region that you would see. This is a bird's eye view of what the camera is seeing. So we're only seeing the fibers that we need to see on demand as they come into the frame. It's kind of a common workflow, but I always think it's fun to look at. And so here's kind of a look at what that result looks like macro. And a lot of it has to do, a lot of it was shading process, and I mean, it's still not perfect, but we took it as far as we could for the time that we had. I was happy with it. So the next setup I want to talk about is similar, but instead of tearing a piece of paper apart, we're going to tear a ginger root apart. So let's take a look at first the spot that features it, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit more about it. So yeah, working on a Louis Vuitton commercial is sort of a bucket list item we never knew we had, but when it happened, we were like, wow, okay, like excellent. Like we were all super pumped to work on this. And yeah, really it's just about kind of taking those different ingredients that go into the different fragrances and sort of representing them in a dreamy like way that you really can only achieve in CG. So lots of zero gravity elements in there, but the part, it was right at the beginning. It's this part right here where the tear is happening. So it's a very brief part of the ad, but it was still really fun to explore nonetheless. So this is the inspirational photography that was sent to us. You can see that we've got we got a lemon and a grapefruit, and then in the middle here we've got this kind of this shard of ginger. So it's a kind of a different view of ginger than I have in my mind. In my mind, I think of ginger from the grocery store. It looks like this bulbous root. But this is really kind of like almost like a fibrous cross section of it. So we really wanted to kind of capture these fibers in here and just kind of have it appear to be, feel hard as well, but a little bit bendy, so we just kind of explored that. Initially, this is sort of a representative CG version of the image we just looked at. So adding the zero gravity elements of the water and whatnot, the grapefruit and the lemon, and then this in the middle here is sort of where our ginger wound up. So some early R&D, I thought maybe we could do it with all fibers. We'll just do all hair constraints. We'll kind of stick them together with some glue constraints, and it wasn't really working that well. I mean, like maybe you could get there, but I feel like it would need an extremely high number of substeps and constraint iterations and stuff to really truly feel hard like it needed to. So in the next version of that, we mixed tetrahedral soft bodies with the fibers as well to kind of create this type of a tear. So you can kind of see it's just the stick portion of it feels a little bit more rigid. So let's go look at a demo of how this was set up. So we start with a little wood chip off Megascans, and we just kind of poly reduce it and stretch it out to kind of feel like that shape of the root. Then we create a cutting plane, and we add noise to the cutting plane and extrude it a little bit so that when we send it through a Boolean fracture, we get three pieces. We get this left side, a little thin sliver in the middle, and then a right side. And then over here, what we're going to do is create our fibers. So we're going to scatter a bunch of points on that root, and then we're going to add normals to the root. We're going to do the double cross product to create a velocity field that flows along the root, and then rasterize it into a volume, and then add a little bit of volume noise to it to wind up with something like this. So procedurally generated fibers kind of flowing along the ginger root. We bring in an SDF of the ginger root and group the fibers that are close to the root and delete the ones that are far away. And that kind of gives us these fibers that are nice and tightly packed around the surface of the geometry. Then over here, we're doing the exact same thing for that sliver in the middle. So we're scattering the points and doing the flow lines. And these are going to be sort of the fibers that are helping us when we're peeling apart. Here, I'm just adding a group based off of the curve U attribute to help with pinning and constraints later on down the road. Here we are preparing our root geometry. So we're just going to remesh it for a tetrahedral soft body and send it through this for each loop. And the for each loop is just basically going to create a pin constraint at the tip of each one of those shards using this. It's dynamically creating this pin 0 and pin 1 group using this wrangle in here that you can see. And then we're actually going to pin the bottoms so that they don't kind of drift off like they did in that other R&D example. We're just going to pin that bottom group in place and bring them together and do a very simple animation. We're just grabbing that root pin 1 group and just moving it off to the side, grabbing the other one, moving it off to the side. It looks weird here in SOPs, but once you feed this data into Vellum, it all ends up working out. So here we're just setting up our tetrahedral soft bodies for the ginger roots themselves, pretty standard. And then here we're setting up our pin constraints for the root pins groups. So each group's getting that put in there. We're doing soft constraints for that. And then here we're doing the other pin constraints for the base of that twig. And those are just stopped. Here we're actually gluing the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And you can kind of see those constraints there. And we're giving this a breaking threshold as well so that eventually they'll overcome the stress and start to peel apart. And then we create our hair constraints for the fibers in between the two roots. And yeah, we're pinning some of those points to the animation as well from that group that we created earlier. And then down here, we're going to actually glue the fibers to themselves. So we're going to introduce like a little bit of stickiness into the system, but we're giving it a very low breaking threshold, but just enough to kind of keep fibers to kind of feel like they want to be stuck to one another for a little bit. And here we're doing a similar thing. We're just gluing the fibers back onto the roots. So we're adding a stitch constraint to attach those fibers to the roots. Also giving it a super low breaking threshold like that. So these are the fiber to fiber constraints, and these are the fiber to root constraints. And then we send that through Vellum, and we wind up with something that kind of looks like this. So here's a base Vellum sim. You can see that we're still doing this kind of zero gravity, kind of dreamy peel of this ginger root, having it pull apart like so. So in this next section over here, we're going to get our high-res geometry back onto the low-res geometry. So we're going to bring in our fibers, we're going to bring in the higher-res root geometry that we had, and we're going to assign a class to either side. And that's going to, we're also going to assign a class to the middle sliver so that it conforms to the left-hand side here. So we're just by hand setting its class to match the left-hand side, and then promoting that class attribute to a point attribute. And then when we go into this point deform, we can use this piece attribute, this class attribute, to make it so that we're point deforming each side separately. So bringing in our low-res simulation geometry, we can make sure the classes are all assigned correctly here as well, and then that will match up when we want to do the deformation of our low-res geometry. So we're not getting any crossover between the two different sides. So here you can kind of see that low-res geometry, or the high-res geometry being kind of pulled apart independently. And it kind of has like a nice kind of sticky resistance to it with those constraints breaking and whatnot. Then over here, we're just post-processing. We're grabbing some of the hairs and thickening them, so we're just sweeping them a little bit, and then we're exporting some of them as just regular splines, as well as the exterior fibers here and the root geometry itself. And then in this section, what I wanted to do is add some secondary particle motion to it. So we're bringing in just the roots themselves and creating sort of a velocity field around it. So we're just going to create this very low res density around it. I like to add noise to the density because it helps me visualize the simulation, but we're not going to be using this smoke in any way other than grabbing its velocity field. So we bring in the root also as a collider and measure its velocity and put it into a very low res smoke sim. So this is kind of a look at that. It's not, this smoke sim isn't intended to be like gorgeous or anything. It's just for visual purposes so that we can kind of see what the velocities are doing, because we really don't need that high res of velocities to get a cool look out of our particles when we advect them. So I just kind of save this one and we grab the velocity field from that and bring it over to a pop sim. So here for our pop source, our particle source, we're going to use another of the debris source nodes. And you can see, like, we're doing this again. You know, as the pieces peel apart, we're spawning points right at that region that's separating. And then inside pops, we're using pop advect by volumes, one of the best nodes ever, to bring in that velocity field and get this dreamy particle look from our simulation. You can kind of see like that. Here's another look at that particle sim. So it gets that kind of like airfield, dreamy kind of look to it. And here's a rendering of that setup. So this is kind of tearing the ginger apart, and you can see there's little particles, and this is kind of like flowing around, and it has this kind of zero gravity look, and this is very similar to what made it into the spot. Additionally, I tried to do another version of this that felt a little bit more grounded in reality. So just by tweaking a couple of the glue stiffnesses and reducing the particles and the anti-gravity aspects of it, and just adding some more damping to the situation, I tried to make one that just kind of felt a little bit more rigid and so on. So that's an alternate version of that. And in the last example I wanted to talk about was this fruit explosion. So we're going to be talking about this exploding lemon that we recently R&D'd. And let's take a look at some of the early fruit R&D we did. This is sort of taking a RBD, kind of your classic RBD setup, and trying to like Vellumize it, if you will. So I'm going to do a really quick demo of this really basic setup and kind of compare the RBD to Vellum workflow. And then we can kind of look at a more complicated one after. So here you can see this is a comparison. On the left-hand side, we've got standard RBD fracture. And then on the right-hand side, we have like the same thing, but with just some additional work done to kind of make it Vellumized. So your usual setup, you bring in like an RBD material fracture node, and it splits out high-res geometry, high-res pieces for you, as well as low-res pieces for you, and you just simulate on that. You pack it up. I'm adding just a little bit of velocity here and then sending it through the RBD bullet solver. You get this nice low-res fracture, and everything's great. And then the next usual thing in the workflow is use this transform pieces SOP to kind of get the high-res geometry back onto the low-res geometry, like so. So in Vellum, it's a really similar process. I'm going to take the exact same RBD material fracture, get my high-res pieces, but then on the low-res pieces, I'm going to process them out, each one in a for each loop. So here I'm going to VDB from polygons. I'm going to reshape it, maybe give it a little bit of we're going to turn it back into polygons. And here, I'm going to remove any islands that may have formed. If there's like a little shard that was kind of floating, we want to get rid of everything except for the largest piece. Transfer the name attribute back onto it, and then we're going to remesh it so that it's ready for these Vellum tetrahedral stuff. So after all that's done, we get a bunch of low-res soft-body ready pieces that look like this. Here we're doing the same thing. We're just adding a little bit of velocity, using the tet conform, and then sending it through your very basic Vellum tetrahedral soft-body constraint. And you wind up with a simulation that kind of looks like this. So it's really similar to what we saw before, except it's got this jello-y, blobby kind of feel to it. You gotta see they got a nice kind of jiggle to them. And then the next thing, instead of doing the transform pieces, we're doing the same thing that we just saw in the ginger. We're taking that name attribute, promoting it to a point, and using the point deform to iterate over all those pieces and bring that high-res geometry onto the low-res geometry. So it was really cool to kind of discover this. I mean, I hadn't really seen anything like it before, but I thought like maybe we could do this. I don't know, and it seemed like it was starting to work as like a prototype. So then we just pushed this as far as we could and add as many more elements to it as we could, and we get this lemon explosion that you see here. So this is combining a bunch of different things. We're obviously using that workflow for the outer peel, but then we're adding additional elements like these little juice sacs in the middle, these membranes that kind of are stuck inside of a lemon, and as well as a pop fluid sim to kind of help tie it all together. So let's take a look at this. We started with, I wanted to kind of cover the three main elements: this peel, the membranes, and the vesicles. So the peel is, the obvious outside the lemon part, the outer lemon part. And then the membranes are these sort of little sections in here that you see inside. And then the vesicles are the little juice sacs that are inside a lemon where all the lemon juice exists. And I wanted to kind of get all three of these elements put together. So this is what that setup looks like. It's quite a bit bigger than the other one. And I can't go through literally every part of it, but just know that a lot of the stuff that isn't being covered is really kind of mundane stuff like managing class names, attributes, and all that stuff. Also procedurally creating point groups and so on and so forth so that we can manage where our constraints are being created in the network. So let's go do a breakdown of the greatest hits of this network, and we can kind of see what's possible. So we start with a lemon from Megascans again. And we VDB from polygons, and we reshape it a little bit so we can create these sections on the inside. So we want to inset it a little bit and then convert it back to polygons. And here, this little circle is going to serve as our Voronoi fracture points. So you can see that we just kind of Voronoi fracture a circle in there, and we get these nice little wedges. And we just remesh them, smooth them out, and peek them in a little bit so they don't intersect. And these are sort of these section walls that are going to contain our vesicles. In this section, we're actually going to model our vesicles. So we're taking a sphere, just doing a little manual edit on it to get this teardrop shape, polyreducing it, and adding a little pinpoint group to the end of the geometry right there. Then we bring in the lemon geometry, and we are going to scatter a bunch of points inside of it, add normals to those points that are kind of radially pointing outward, and then copy those little vesicles onto it. Then we're creating two versions of this. One is deflated, like this, and then another one is inflated. And what we do is we grab one of the lemon wedges that we created before and bring it in, and using a bunch of different group combinations and exclusions and stuff like that, we kind of group out just purely those little vesicles that are fully contained inside of that wedge. So you can see no parts of them, of those juice sacs, are kind of protruding through the outside of that shell. So then here we have our rest blend, or this is going to be our blend shape we're going to use to help inflate these juice sacs. And we're going to just kind of copy that group that we created on the right-hand side of this network in here. So this is going to be our Vellum rest blend target as we inflate these pieces. And then we're going to send it through basically the Vellum configure balloon setup. I think this is Vellum configure balloon out of the box, just a cloth and pressure constraint. And then we send it into the Vellum solver. And inside the Vellum solver, we have a Vellum rest blend that is pointing to that rest blend target. It's going to help inflate those pieces. And then here, you can see we've got one of these wedges kind of inflating and packing those juice sacs in there nicely. So it kind of feels like a lemon. And this is like the most dad joke moment of my life, but we were wedging lemon wedges in PDG. And so I was like, when this happened, it just made me super happy. I feel that my life had come full circle as we were able to, wedge all these pieces out using PDG. And so that's sort of how we can use Vellum to kind of like model an initial state for our simulation. We haven't even gotten into the explosion part yet, but it's also like a really handy modeling and packing tool. So we wind up with these nice, this nice array of these vesicles that are all kind of organized in the way that they need to be to kind of give the feeling of being a lemon. Over here, we're just doing an additional peak to make sure nothing is like kind of intersecting with the outer shells. And here's just sort of a look at one of those inflating. We kind of saw this before. And here's sort of all of them just kind of inflating into place, all merged back together. Then in this section, we're just going to prepare the peel. And so we're going to bring in sort of some geometry that's based off of those wedges that we created. We're kind of combining it into this sort of piece of geometry that you see here, inset from the surface. We're going to bring it in and Boolean it out from the inside of our original lemon geometry. So we get this thin kind of shell around the outside that can be our peel. Then we create cutting planes. We're going to fracture it here. We're adding noise to our cutting planes, copying them into space a little bit, rotating them, and then we get our fracture geometry like this. And I'm also adding a mask in here for shading purposes so we can kind of control our shader, the different colors on the surface and inside the lemon. Then this big loop right here is what we did in the simpler example, except it's a little bit more involved. So you can see that we get our low-res tetrahedral kind of geometry that we're going to need in here, but there's issues. So some of these pieces are too small to be processed through VDB and still exist. So inside of this loop, we've got a little check that says, basically, if there's no pieces incoming on this switch, on the left-hand side of this switch, I want you to just abort and grab this geometry from the input and just send it through and add it to a group that says it was too small to be processed. So we're going to have, at the end of this, a bunch of pieces that were problems. We couldn't get them to kind of work correctly. And so in order to fix that situation, we bring those pieces over here and they get sort of adopted to the nearest lemon piece that exists. So here you can see these are two of the pieces that kind of were problems. And I'm just going to kind of go through these slides real quick. But here what we do is we bring in all of the high-res fracture pieces. We bring in the pieces that were too small. And then down here, what we're doing is we're basically just isolating and saying, we're looping over this and saying, this blast is going to look up whatever piece is being processed in this node right here. And so just by using this little expression, it's looking up and seeing if that piece, if it has it here, it's gonna grab it. And then this node is gonna basically say, well, if we found a piece over here, there is a piece in this node, then that means that the piece that we're processing on the high-res fracture is actually too small. So we will then bring in every piece except for that too small piece, and then do an attribute transfer of the name attribute back onto that piece. And here we're just going to promote that name attribute to a detail, and we're going to use the promotion method of mode. So the most frequently occurring name is going to take over the entire detail attribute, which then down here is just going to be looked up and transferred back to exclusively this too small group. And so what we're left with in the end is that these pieces that were too small to be processed just get glued right back onto the largest piece of geometry that was the largest closest piece of geometry that actually succeeded in that loop that we did before. So that's kind of complicated, but in the end, we rescue all these pieces and kind of attach them back. You can see a before and after there of those pieces being put back onto that geometry. Then over here, we're just getting things ready for Vellum and adding our tetrahedral constraints. And here, we're going to enumerate all of these pieces. So we're enumerating the name into a name index attribute we're going to use to track these chunks together, because we want to have our other geometry kind of follow along with this. And so you can see here that we're going to actually transfer that name index attribute onto this geometry, so we can use it to fracture apart our membranes in a way that would cohere with them blasting away in this way. So here I'm just kind of breaking it apart and smoothing down those edges so they look a little bit nicer. And this is sort of our new membranes geometry. So this is sort of, we just send this through a cloth constraints and we're good to go. We do the same thing over here with the vesicles. We transfer that name index attribute. You can see some of these pieces actually have more than one name index attribute. So we do a similar thing. We promote by mode to kind of make it so that each one of these little vesicles has only one name index attached to it. So otherwise it'll get all stretchy and messed up when we do our sim. And then here, so you can see, if I do an exploded view based off of name, we get individual wedges. But if we do it off of name index, you can see that those wedges are starting to conform to the pieces of geometry we created for the shell. And then what we're doing is sending it through a cloth constraint setup here. So we're just adding cloth to those juice sacks. And then here, we are adding glue constraints. So here we're using the name index attribute as a cluster attribute again. So we're only gluing these vesicles together if they are of the same name index. So the purple only attaches to the purple, and the pink only attaches to the pink, and so on. That sort of helps assist with the explosion happening in a regular way. We also give that a very low breaking threshold. We're merging them all together here, and you can kind of see that they're all kind of coordinated. If I do another exploded view based off of name index, you can see all those pieces are going to move together, and we're going to be able to create constraints in the next section to kind of keep them, together using this name index as a cluster attribute. Here I'm just going to merge in the I'm merging in the constraint geometry and then doing a glue. So here I'm gluing different parts of this to each other. So I'm gluing the vesicles onto the membranes here, using the name index as a cluster attribute just to restrict it to only like name indices, and then giving it a breaking threshold as well. So adding a little bit of stickiness into the system. And then here, we're doing another constraint where we are gluing the membranes, the inner membranes, to the surface of the outer shell or the peel. And we're also using the name index attribute here as a cluster attribute. And so that's sort of kind of like an overview of the base Vellum sim that was set up. And you can see all those pieces are pulling apart like so. This is sort of the raw Vellum simulation. So here's another view of that Vellum simulation, and it still needs a little bit of work, but it's doing it. We've got pieces that are kind of sticking together. It feels almost plausible. We're getting there. And then what I do in this section right here is I'm just I'm creating a master retime node. So this little animation curve in the corner is just accelerating that explosion by hand, just using a retime. And we are going to reference this master retime other places in the network as we speed up our other sims to kind of match that timing. So here's the time remap version. You can see we kind of ramp slow-mo. And I'm getting, I did simulate this and cache out all like 4 substeps. So I could, if you don't have enough substeps when you're doing a slow-mo, you might actually have you might not get these rotations that we're getting here. They might not come through correctly because of interpolation and stuff. So we did add extra substeps to the cache. Then in here, this section, we're going to be putting the high-res geometry back on the low-res geometry. So a lot what we just saw already. We're promoting the name attribute from primitive to point and using the point deform with that piece attribute set to name. You can see all those pieces, all the high-res pieces are doing what the low-res pieces did. We send it through the retimer and export it. We also post-process the vesicles a little bit and the membranes as well and export those for rendering. Then in this section over here, we're going to be doing the pop fluid setup. So we just bring in we're bringing in the vesicles and the shell and using it as a VDB collider. And then here what we're going to do is actually use the debris source node like we've done before to detect when those pieces are bursting apart. Those are going to be the emitters for our pop fluid sim. And then down here, you can kind of see just this is what the pop fluid sim looks like raw. We were going to be doing, I wanted to do it using Vellum. I would have done it using Vellum fluids, but this was right around the time that 19 came out and we weren't able to fully switch over to Vellum fluids for this project. But that's sort of an overview of that setup. Oh yeah, we just mesh that, and here's sort of a all the elements in a flip book. You can kind of see them all flying apart. We've got this one kind of nice chunk down there that's kind of sticking together, and some of them are all flying apart. And here's another final look at that rendering of all those lemon pieces flying apart. It was very satisfying to finally get to that point because it took days. And we tried this with some other fruits. So here's an early example of a watermelon version. We filled it with grains and also other tetrahedral soft bodies, and there's problems here. We didn't particularly like the way some of these pieces looked, so we iterated on it some more, and the next version kind of looked like this. We were using nothing but grains on the inside as well as pop fluids, taking some of the grains and instancing watermelon seeds on them to kind of create this watermelon explosion. Here's another view of that watermelon explosion kind of in slow-mo. And in motion graphics, we don't get to do a lot of gore or anything, but I imagine this would be as close as you could get for a workflow like that. Vellum might be handy in that type of workflow is all I'm saying. And that is it for the presentation. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Side Effects for having me out here. Also, Already Been Chewed for sponsoring this crazy thing that we all love to do, graphics and whatnot. And also a super special thank you to my wife and my 2 children for their awesome support. They sacrificed so much for me to be able to do this. So.